me. I'm Nick, product manager. I work on GKE fleets and teams. Al's a customer engineer. And here's the agenda, right? So we're going to start with the challenge, and then 30 minutes of live demo. So what could go wrong, right? And so the challenge is that can you build a platform on GKE using fleets in 30 to 45 minutes? We're going to save some time for Q&A unless things go absurdly wrong. But what do we mean by platform, right? No, we're not going to talk about that here. We could talk about that all day long at other points in time, but this talk is not about defining what a platform is. It's about building on top of GKE using some of the multi-cluster features that we're shipping. This is a hotly debated topic. I do want to say, I want to put it on wax for all of you, that IDP, the P stands for platform, not portal. That's my stance. So if you take away anything from this session, the P in IDP stands for portal, and you should all use fleets. All right, so this is the desired state of our demo. We have two environments. We have our dev fleet and our production fleet. We've sort of set up the dev fleet like Julia Childs, right? It's in the oven, it's out of the oven, it's baked, it's cooked, and I'll use that to reference throughout building live the production version of the fleet. You can see here that the desired state is having multiple clusters in each fleet in multiple regions, and then using our multi-cluster features for networking and desired state with configuration to ensure that when I ship an application, it gets spread across all of the clusters. And so that when we hit an endpoint for apps that need to hit specific locality preferences, it shows up to, like if you hit it from Vegas, you're going to hit the GKE cluster running, the GKE cluster that's running closest to us, right? So let's go through it. Demo starts now. The next slide you see should be a wrap. There we go. All right, so everybody familiar with this view? Yeah? Show of hands, who's not seen this view before? There's one person. I appreciate you coming here. You should look at this more often. So this is the Google Cloud Console. And what we're looking at is the Google Kubernetes Engine view within the console. Right now, I'm in my production project. There is no fleet yet. I've called it fleet because naming, but there's no fleet just yet. So I'm going to walk you through the onboarding experience of using the UI to enable fleets. Yes, introducing the next evolution of container platforms. Just a call out here, there's 90-day free trials if you want to use GKE Enterprise. GKE Enterprise is a SKU of GKE that gives you a lot of fleet features, multi-cluster features built into it. All that to say that Fleets itself is not a for-charge product. There are things you could do with Fleet for free, and when you decide you want to use something like multi-cluster ASM or multi-cluster gateway, you can turn on GKE Enterprise. But I'm going to enable GKE Enterprise. It's kind of cool. You've got a nice little compare plan section too if you want, right? So you can see the difference, and we try to give you an estimated upcharge or a guess, kind of. This doesn't include your discounts that I'm sure you negotiated. So I'm going to enable GKE Enterprise. When I enable GKE Enterprise to the portal, what it's going to do is enable the Anthos API and the GKE Hub API. These are APIs that are required to run Enterprise. And I'm going to hit confirm. And now what it's doing is it's enabling Fleet on this project. I just want to call out that Fleets, if you're using this aggregation of multiple clusters called a fleet is just a special project. You can only have one fleet in a project. You can't have, I'm looking at Ben, you can't have multiple fleets in the same project because it is actually just a very special project. What you can do is you can create a fleet in project one and take any other cluster in any other project within your org and register from those cluster projects to the fleet project. So it's a way to centrally manage all of the clusters that you have across your organization, right? You probably want to separate them by environment at the least, so you're going to have a dev fleet, probably, and a production fleet. Or if you're big enough, you might have dev business unit 1 and prod business unit 1 fleets, and then you have a list of them, of that slice per business units. So I've turned it on, and now you could see after I turn that on, the enterprise label is here. The UI looks a little bit different. There's some new things in there. We're gonna walk through them today. But I still haven't actually registered, oh, I did. I registered these clusters to the fleet when I turned it on. Now you can see they're in fleet prod 1. And if I go to the overview, there's 2 things that were turned on. I did a little bit of baking in production. One of them is when I created the clusters, I turned on a lot of the advanced vulnerability scanning features only because they take time to install. So as you're building out your environments, you're probably not going to do them in the UI. You're probably going to do them in some infrastructure as code. I just want you to know that as you're doing these things, you could think about how you're going to enable certain features, and certain features are enabled on the GKE API, like the actual cluster create, and then other features can be enabled centrally with Fleet Manager, and I'm going to walk through that right now. So, great new list of left nav list of features. I'm going to come down to Feature Manager and wait for the load time. And we will start with enabling Policy Controller. So Policy Controller is our version of managed Gatekeeper. If anyone using Gatekeeper today? Yeah? That's not as many as I thought. So Gatekeeper is sort of the open source standard for creating and enforcing policies across your clusters, right? And so we have a managed version. We lovingly call it POCO. And I'm going to turn it on. But the way I'm doing that is I'm going to customize my fleet settings. So this is a fleet default config that's central to the production fleet. And I'm going to turn on all the bundles because I really need to be secure. And one thing that's interesting, just to call out here, is we've recently enabled the ability to do aggregated references. So if you want to use that feature, which means like you can make a decision after you make an API call somewhere else, as opposed to just doing it all at policy time. So it's like admission control kicks in. Maybe you want to do you want to set a resource quota across multiple namespaces, across multiple clusters, but you need to actually call out to some endpoint that understands how many resources are running across multiple clusters before you can decide whether or not you want to add that new pod or namespace within your fleet. So cool feature. All these things are turned on. I would save changes, but I already have that set now. Again, that's the central state. So if I come back and go into details, you're going to see this ability to sync to fleet settings, right? So I'm going to check mark both of these clusters, and I'm going to take the settings that I just configured centrally and sync them to each cluster in the fleet. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so you can see now that it's syncing with the fleet and the status is pending. This is now we're gonna look at the one that's baked in the oven for a quick second. This is the other fleet in this environment, fleet dev 1, and I just want to take you for a ride through POCO. So once that's enabled, you're going to get a dashboard view that's going to show you all of the constraints that you just turned on and the status of your clusters and workloads against those constraints. You can see I have things like CIS Kubernetes benchmark turned on, pod security standards a la 22, some NIST standards. So there's a lot of different pre-bundled constraint templates that we build for you, and you could turn them on, and then you could take a dip in and look at the violations that are running across all of the clusters in your fleet. So for CIS benchmark, let's look at one. What's interesting? Prohibit role wildcard access. Cool. So what does this constraint actually look like? Hey, there's the template. So if you're into reading YAML, you can. And then also you can look at the affected resources. and sort of have a good part to start from if you actually want to start remediating these issues. Okay? So that is policy controller. I also want to call out that when you turn this on in the way that I just turned it on, it's in audit mode. None of this stuff is being enforced. So all of the templates that I just showed you, those bundles, are running out of band of your cluster. None of those constraints have to be installed on your cluster. We're doing it all centrally. So like the admission control for these things happens by a managed service. If you want to enforce these policy standards, like maybe you don't want to allow privileged service account access from within your deployments, then you have to deploy that template, that constraint in those clusters and change it so that it's in an enforcement mode. And so when someone tries to deploy a deployment and they're using a service account that they shouldn't, it's got escalated privileges, admission control will block it from happening. If you want to, you could take it a step further and mutate, right? So you can mutate the deployment and remove that privileged access. So those are all ways that you can use it, again, upstream open source policy controller gatekeeper, but using it as a managed service, so you don't have to update the actual engine. We take care of that for you. All right, so that's policy. Let's go back to our unbaked pie and look at some of the other features, right? So I'm going to go back into Feature Manager. And another thing that I want to turn on is security posture. This is already on, but I'm going to pretend like it isn't, right? Because why not? So you can see here that I have security posture, and the first thing I would do if this were not already enabled on clusters is I would come into, where are you? Configure, and then I would pick the settings, right? Do I want to have configuration audit turned on? So configuration audit is part of our security posture that will look and make recommendations for best practices for actual Kubernetes configuration, right? Do I want to turn on vulnerability scanning? And our vulnerability scanning is looking at language packs for like the top 5 programming language, Go, Python. I forget the rest of them off the top of my head, but the idea here is it'll surface any known CVEs that are running in your clusters if you enable this. So they're both already set at the default configuration. Now what I'll do is, again, hit configure. It's going to enable the container security. Any APIs that aren't enabled, it'll give you a prompt to enable them. And then I need to, again, sync those settings to the fleet. So all I'm doing is changing the central configuration here. I've not actually propagated that change across the fleet. So I'm going to, if these settings are already synced, which in this case, the default fleet config that I configured is already set on the clusters, you're not going to be able to select them. So if these settings were not already installed on the clusters, I would check it and then hit sync to fleet. So let's look at let's take a second to drive through what that looks like. All right, I'm doing all right on time. So we're going to navigate back over to the dev fleet. I'm going to take a look at KSP, security posture. Where are you? And you get another pretty handy dashboard that's going to give you information about how you're performing against all of the scans that are running now within your fleet. You could toggle by concerns, and you could drive in and you could pick, critical concerns, look for a particular CVE. Oh, thank you. Wake up. And check out a CVE for Alpine, for example. You can see the CVSS score, when it got fixed, and a description of the CVE. It gives you a list of recommended actions, which is handy, and then you can actually look at all the affected workloads. You can see here that we need to do some work in updating the Boutique app, which I'm sure everyone has deployed at some point if you use Google Cloud. There's some CVEs that need to be patched there. So what you're looking at there is advanced vulnerability insights, and there's other sections within security posture, right, where you could look at workload configuration or the OS vulnerability as well. And then I haven't enabled it, but we even have a preview for threat detection. So there's some other talks on this stuff. They may have already happened, but you should definitely reach out to the PMs of the security team while you're here if you have time. All right, so we've done two things so far. We've turned on security. Hey, we turned on security manager. We turned on or security posture. We turned on policy. My life wouldn't be complete if I tried to install a service mesh live in front of an audience of, I don't know, 200, 300 people. So let's do it. Service mesh. We have a managed version of service mesh, which adheres to upstream Istio, right? So we basically run a service mesh. The control plane is not in your clusters. It's out of your clusters. And you just use the Istio API as you would with a couple of caveats, which we won't get in here. But for the most part, it's pretty up to date with upstream. So I want to make sure that that ASM's installed in my fleet. I'm going to view or edit the fleet settings just to make sure. What it's going to do is make sure that workload identity is enabled. You need workload identity and fleet workload identity enabled to use ASM. What that means is that the identity provider, the trust, is all set up using either the Google CA or you can use a Google CA and bring your own root, but the point is that you're setting up a trust domain for this entire fleet when you turn this feature on. It's good to know. Oh, that's why. I didn't switch back to prod. I was wondering why it was installed. All right, so let's look. You can see here that let's edit the fleet config settings. Yes, I'll take those changes, and I am going to highlight the clusters yet again. Oh, wow. Come on. Sorry about that. And I'm going to sync to fleet settings, right? So what this is going to do is it's going to install a control plane per cluster. One thing just to let you all know, not a lot of people realize this, if you use our service mesh, our managed service mesh, and you use it across multiple clusters within a fleet, you actually get a control plane per cluster. And then we handle sort of the trust between all of those control planes and the cross-cluster discovery. So there's not like a blast radius of 1 mega cluster, or 1 mega service mesh. There's a service mesh per cluster, so that if a control plane goes down on any particular service mesh, the other service meshes will still function, right? It's good to know that the blast radius is a lot smaller than I think people realize. Okay, so it's enabled. It takes a minute to install. I want to move on to the next section, and I'll come back and show you kind of what I'm doing with service mesh later. The next thing I want to talk about is config sync. So there's many GitOps solutions out there, many, basically 3 for GitOps pull, right? There's Argo CD, which is great. There's Flux, which is still strong in the open source community despite things. And then there's our version, which is config sync. All 3 of them are supported in fleets. When you use config sync, you're going to get more of a managed experience because it's our GitOps tool, and we manage the life cycle of the sync agents on your behalf. But you can still use Argo CD and Flux and with fleets, just to be clear. So let's configure config sync. So I'm going to customize the fleet settings here. This is in preview. Historically, you'd have to manually upgrade the config sync agents that are running on all of your clusters, but we are shipping now auto upgrades. And so if you allow us, then we will make sure that your config sync agents are up to date with the latest versions. So I am going to do what we've done a few times here. This is a pattern, right? I hit configure, APIs enable. I go in, I select the clusters, I sync them to that central config, and then it installs the config sync in all those clusters. I also have a default repo set up with config sync, so that when I do this sync, it's gonna reach out to, it's gonna point all those clusters at a root repo, a root sync repo, that has a list of configuration, which I'll show you here in a second. All right, so highlight these, sync, confirm. and this one is, config sync is probably the longer tail. It usually averages about 7 to 8 minutes for the configuration I set up to get these clusters up to a usable state. It's just, there's a lot of things that are getting installed, and I'll show you what they are here in a sec. So going back to feature manager, there's one more thing I want to enable, which is kind of critical to this demo, which is multi-cluster ingress. I'm actually using multi-cluster gateway. Show of hands, who's using the gateway API in real life? 1, 2, okay. You should investigate the gateway API. Gateway API is replacing ingress. It's a better security model. It separates the front end from the routes, and it allows for much more control over routing. So if you're not looking at it, you should. But it's the replacement for what we've been using for years, which is the ingress API. So I'm going to enable multi-cluster ingress or multi-cluster gateway, and when I do this, I have to choose a config controller cluster. So only one cluster can control the state of the load balancers it will create on my behalf across multiple clusters at any given point in time. Best practice here is to push the configuration of your gateways to more than one cluster, so that if that cluster has an issue, then you can make a quick API call that changes this from central to east. And the state is in both of those clusters, so nothing should change, right? All right. So now we've done a lot of things. How am I doing on time? Okay. So all this is set up. And I'm just going to walk through the repo really quick, and then we're gonna get to some fun demos. So this is the repository that I'm syncing to. Default configs is the default config folder, and you can see that there's a couple of extra constraints that I'm installing. Here's the gateways, right? These are the multi-cluster gateways I was talking about. I can show you one just so you get an idea for what the spec looks like. Here's a gateway. You can see I've got the front end where I'm mounting a certificate and I'm calling out a pre-created IP, public IP. So that's a single IP. And then I'm creating some routes. So ingress API, these things would be essentially in the same object. Now they're separate. And I can I can create a gateway as a platform engineer, and then I can give access to routes to manipulate that gateway to specific namespaces and specific users. So the RBAC model allows me to not give my developers access to do things like certificate management and change public IPs, but they can actually change the routes, so it's pretty handy. So all this YAML is focused on deploying load balancers. And then there's a couple other things that are happening. The other thing I want to call out too is I have this tenant factory, if you will. So within tenants, I have one team. Where am I? And then there's a back end and a front end. And we're going to show more of this later, but the one thing I want to call out is I'm using a repo sync in each of these namespaces. So the back end and the front end are actual namespaces, such that whenever I create a fleet namespace, which I'll show you in a second, where is it? There's a selector that then is watching for namespaces of this name and creating a repo sync to sync configuration to that namespace across all the clusters that are bound to the team scope that I'm going to create later. And I also have a folder here where I've got the actual configuration that I want to sync. So front end, for example, is an app. I've got this cool destination rule, which means that when when it tries to call a downstream service and it fails, it'll reach out over to central. So I've established a priority. and a virtual service since I'm using Istio to hit this endpoint. Okay, so I'm up against it right now. There's one more thing I'm going to show you, which is teams. So we created a fleet. A fleet is for groups of clusters. On top of a fleet, you can create tenants. And just because I'm short on time, I'm just going to focus on dev here. You can see I have two teams that I've created, Team FNL and Team Where Am I? And I have like interesting billing metrics for the pods and the resources that they're using that show up. I can dive into Team Where Am I and see who has access. So this is actually an Okta group called Where Am I? Because we're using Okta here as an IDP. We're not actually using Google Cloud identity. I can see which namespaces are created within this team scope. I can create more namespaces. I can add, and then I can add clusters to that team scope so that when I add a cluster to this team scope, it will automatically install that namespace, automatically install the RBAC, and then because that namespace selector that I created earlier is watching for that namespace name, it will sync everything from the team's repo into those namespaces. So this is the state of the world now. This world, my demo. And I have a demo app that's running, right? And you can see here, you've probably seen this Where Am I app in quite a few demos. If I refresh, this is live. You guys can hit this endpoint. You're going to get routed to East 1. And the reason you get routed to East 1 is because, the cluster is only installed in East 1 right now, okay? So hopefully that gives you an idea of like where we're at this point in the journey. I'm gonna invite Al on stage to go through a couple of interesting CUJs here. Al is my app operator, and he's got some CUJs he's going to walk through. So bring us home, bud.
All right, cool, it works. All right, thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone. So what you just saw was Nick finished provisioning the production environment, and the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to play the role of two separate operators who are going to deploy workloads inside of this environment. So let's get started. How do I tab this? Which one am I in? Oh, I'm in Alice. Yep, I'm already there. You had toggled me. All right, cool. So, so the first operator I'm going to play is the role of Alice. Alice is the team lead for the Where Am I application team. You can see here, I'm logged in as Alice operator. All right. And the application Nick just showed you is the Where Am I app, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It just provides a lot of diagnostic information from where the service is running. As Nick called out, it's running on East, and this is the front-end endpoint. So two things I'm going to do. First off, I'm going to install a backend for the service. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to extend this service to Central so that it's running closer so you can have a better experience here. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. So first thing I want to call out is as Alice, you see immediately I don't have the ability to create or even view data on these clusters. Why? Because as an operator, I don't have full cluster permissions. I'm scoped down to that team that I have access to. So if I go to Teams, so I'm going to go to Teams and show you what my experience would be like. Give it a minute to load. All right, let's give it a whirl here. Ah, I see what happened. Let me log in. Okay. My session timed out. Okay, so cheated ahead. I was going to show you Okta login. You got a sneak peek. All right, cool. So my session timed out. So now I'm under Teams. I'm going to go to Team. Where am I? So there are multiple teams within this fleet, but as an operator, I only have view to the teams that I'm a member of. So again, what is a team? It's essentially a collection of developers and/or app operators that have access to one or multiple fleet namespaces that are governed by a set of RBAC policies, right? So those are kind of tailoring down the experience for me as Alice and that app operator. So I'm going to go to Team. Where am I? Let me walk through a few things. First off, this is a default page. You see the workloads I have access to. So if I click on workloads, you can see that I have the where am I front end, right? I won't dive into that. Nick just kind of walked through that a moment ago. Next thing I want to call out is monitoring. So what's cool about this, right, is this is a monitoring experience, and you'll hear me say this a few times, but this monitoring experience is tailored down to just the services that run within my team scope. So as I extend that, I add more services. That's going to be able to tailor down in this particular view. So you see I have CPU, I have memory. Scroll down, you see that those namespaces that I have permission to. I'm about ready to create another one. But this is all scoped down for me as the team operator. Clusters, Nick showed you. We have East. I'm going to add in that team Central. And what that should do, as Nick walked through, is use that namespace selector to trigger the repo sync to get created, and then sync the services within that region into Central. That should all happen automatically for me, right? I'm going to skip a little ahead to logs because I'm going to come back to namespace. Again, that repeat theme. These logs are tailored down to just the logs of the resources running within my namespace. So this is great because, you know, it just enhances my experience so that I have a personalized view of what I'm running. One other tab that you don't see here, because I don't have billing permissions yet, I was trying to enable that, but is also cost optimization. So what we built into the portal experience is that you can see what is your resources that you have limit set on, what is your quota, and then how are you running against that quota to find out how efficient you are, so that you can find out you can better charge back and get a better costing experience. All of that's kind of built in as well. So I'm going to go back to namespaces, and you see that one that I have. And the next thing I'm going to do is add a namespace. And I'm going to call this where am I dash backend. And I'm going to update the team scope. And you see that created. All right, cool. So now I have that new backend. I'm going to tilde over to this one. And all right, so I'm going to toggle over to Nick's login. Why? Because I want to show you what config sync is doing when I create that namespace. And as Alice, I don't have that ability because I don't have the ability to see config sync with my permission. So I'm going to scroll down here, and what you should see in a moment is that because Nick, as my SRE, pre-created the namespace selector for both the front end and back end namespaces, that should trigger the creation or the execution of the repo sync, and then that will then sync the services, back-end services into the back-end namespace. So, and there it is. Where am I back-end? So this is happening real time. I'm extending so that I have time to give it to bake. All right, and I'm going to refresh this. And what this is doing is now pulling down those services, deploying them into the namespace, syncing them with config sync, and boom. I've thoroughly stalled to the point now where I should be able to click over here, hit refresh, and there you go. Now I've already got a back end. Awesome. So the next thing I want to do is I want to now add in a cluster for Central. Why? Kind of what I talked to. As soon as I add in that cluster to Central, it's going to sync that namespace, that fleet namespace, to Central as well, and all the services should pull back down. Now, one thing I want to call back to is because Nick called out the fleet is deployed with gateway, with a ingress gateway, that should then redirect based on where the query is coming from, which is this room. So it should then toggle the connection over to the West Coast services running out of Central, and you should see backend or the Where Am I app connecting to West Coast. So Mr. SRE, you want to get up here and add in a cluster? Now, I should have called out, I don't have the ability to add in clusters. So.
Yeah, we don't add capacity. We don't let our app developers add capacity, but you could. That's living a little dangerously, but you totally could. So I'm going to go back over to pretend like this is now on my machine, right? And I want to add a cluster. And I just want to make sure I'm in the right team. So teams, where am I? I'm going to add a cluster for my buddy Al here. So one thing I would probably do before I add that cluster, though, is like I know because this is a canned demo that I have capacity to add him to central, but maybe I don't. So this is the decision point. Do I create another cluster to support this request to extend this application across multiple regions, or do I find capacity that I already have? So I'm going to be able to choose from the list of clusters in my fleet and add capacity. In this instance, there's only one other cluster in central, and I know it has room because it's a demo. So I'll add it, update team scope, and that'll take a second, and then as that goes through, similar to before, if we look in our config sync packages, you could see that the root sync is now creating that repo sync per central cluster for each of the front end and back end. So I added a cluster to the team scope. All of the namespaces in that team scope then get created in that cluster, and the repo syncs get created to start syncing in the configuration to those clusters. So yeah, man, we're good to go. You want to come up here and finish it? I'll go back, toggle to your screen.
Doctor?
Yes.
All right, so let me refresh this. Should give it a few minutes. And let me hit refresh one more time. So give it a minute. And what's going to happen is this should naturally now fail over to central, where the service is running. And then that should complete Alice's demo. So running out of stall words.
Yeah, just go to the package.
Go to the package?
Yeah, just see if it's synced.
Yeah, so let me go down here to config. Go to packages.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. It is doing its magic.
Where am I? Open up front end.
Yep.
There you go.
Where am I? Front end.
Okay, and it's syncing.
Yep, and you see it pending. So we'll wait for a minute and wait for this to go. And this is great because, to be honest with you, we ran through this all live. So we fully expect this thing to deploy any second now.
All right. We're
Tell you what.
We're going to give it 10 seconds, and then we'll come back at the end, and we'll show you that it works.
Yep.
10. Can we get a countdown? 10.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Refresh. Pending. All right. Here's what we're going to do, because we want you to know it's real.
Let's go to the next.
Yeah, I'm going to switch over to here. So I'm going to switch personas, and when I finish the second persona, we're going to come back, and that thing will be fully deployed, and everyone's going to clap ecstatically. Sure. All right, cool. So I'm going to close this tab, and I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to open a new incognito tab. Why? Because I am no longer playing the role of Alice. I'm switching over. We're going to do this, okay? My new persona is a gentleman by the name of Raoul Duke, with an O. And I'm going to go to login. So I'm going to start at a slightly different place, all right? I just opened the browser. I'm logging in for the first time as Raoul Duke, right? And as you see, I'm going through Okta because we've federated this with workload federated identity to Okta as our third-party IDP. We support other IDPs. We chose Okta, but I'm going to type this in. Who are you logging in as? Huh? Raoul Duke. Not going to show my password. All right, cool. So that's going to redirect me to the portal. You see here I'm signed in as Mr. Raoul Duke. Great. Let me go down to Kubernetes and then go to Teams. And you see I have access to Team FNL. Anyone want to guess what FNL is? Great. All right, so I'm going to click on Team FNL. And the first thing I'm going to do, besides increase the font a little bit, is go down and I'm going to add a namespace. I'm going to call it welcome. Why? Because I want to create a welcome site for all you so you feel welcome here in Vegas. All right, cool. Now I'm also going to go here and show you that there's nothing up my sleeve. There's no endpoint, or there's nothing running in that service right now. All right, so I have that namespace. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my IDE and I'm going to deploy the application. Why? Because I don't have all the config stuff set up, so I have to do it the old school way. So I'm going to go into my IDE and do it manually. All right, first thing I want to show you is, I'm
just standing up here because I'm his lawyer.
Yeah, oh, I forgot to mention my SRE is also my lawyer, right? Dun-dun-dun. Okay, so you see the Okta file that I'm using. Anyone who's worked with an IDE before, IDP before, is kind of familiar with the context of this file. I just want to show you that that's what we're using. I'm going to do that. I'm going to paste that in there, and I'm going to auth login. It's going to redirect me. Uh-oh. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's normal.
Yep, I forgot. I'm going to copy this.
He just needs to put that in his incognito browser.
I'll put this in here. Uh-oh.
You got to go to your other tab.
Yep, I got it.
Incognito. He loves when I stand over his shoulder. As his lawyer, it's my responsibility to make sure that he's responsible.
I will say that we're logged in as Nick on a machine with incognito. If you're doing this as yourself, you're just going to go in there and it's going to grab the credentials. You don't have to do the copy pasting. There's an extra step in there.
Go.
I'm moving, baby. All right, Command Tab. All right, cool. I should now be logged into my IDE. Cool, you see that I'm logged in. I'm in Fleet Dev. I'm going to do a config list, A, to verify that I'm G-Cloud config list. Boom. You see that I am logged in as Mr. Raul Duke. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to log into the cluster. Now you notice I'm doing this with G-Cloud Container Fleet Membership. You've probably seen this with G-Cloud cluster credentials. The reason I'm doing it with Fleet Membership is I'm connecting to what's called Connect Gateway. Connect Gateway is a fleet service and allows me a couple things. First off, all these clusters are private, so I can't connect to them externally, but by connecting to Connect Gateway, it gives me a secure way to access my clusters running in GCP, but also in other locations. So if I'm running clusters in alt clouds, I'm running on-prem, I can log into Connect Gateway with a single identity, Raul Duke, and then from that Connect Gateway, I can authenticate to the respective location, so it really kind of enhances my experience as a developer as well. I'm going to do a kubectl get namespace welcome. I'm going to skip a step where I was going to show you that it doesn't work. So you see that I have access to welcome namespace. If I did just get namespace, it would fail for permissions. Why? I'm only scoped to that particular team, so I don't have access to all the namespaces in the cluster. All right, the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to show you this real fast, is I'm going to deploy my welcome app. So like we said, we use Connect Gateway. So in addition to the applications that are running, there's the service, there's the deployment, but I also need to create a destination role for that gateway, and I also need to create the virtual service. So let me do a kubectl.
He's on my machine and doesn't realize that I do what every good person does, an alias kubectl with K. As your lawyer, I recommend that you use K.
Yeah, I got on this machine about an hour ago. All right, cool. So I just deployed this service, and let me go to, you see that I am logged in, and let me refresh this. And there you go, the service is up and running. Awesome. All right, so welcome everybody. Now the last thing we're gonna do is cross our fingers and go to front end, and I'm gonna refresh this, and boom, we're in Central. Look at that, folks. Copious amounts of applause for a live demo that went fairly streamlined. All right.
That's it. I don't think we have time for questions because we have 5 seconds left, but we really appreciate you.
Oh, wow.
There's a whole call to action. Fill out surveys that you can find when you use the link, and we're happy to take questions at a band or meet or whatever. Enjoy Next. avoid the bats.
Avoid the bats. Thank you, doctor.